Looking at the response that we get from our post users endpoint, you might notice something a bit disturbing. We actually get the password in the response body in plain text. Now, that's obviously not very secure. So in this video, we're going to be fixing that by removing that and any other of these additional values that we don't need in the user response. When we use Express to load a Mongoose object and send it in a response, Mongoose automatically transforms the model document to a JSON object using a method called toJSON. Now when we create our schema, we can actually add a special transform hook to modify the output of this toJSON method and customize it how we want. So to do this, you'll see in our call to mongoose.schema here, the first argument that we're passing in is a configuration object with all the different fields. Now, we can actually pass in a second configuration object, and this has other special configuration objects that we want to specify. So to hook into the toJSON method, we can actually create this as a property. So we'll go toJSON, and we'll assign that an object, and it should have a property transform. And this is where we can put our hook function. So let's assign a function to this, and the two arguments it's going to have are doc and ret, like that. So doc is the full model document, and ret is a plain object representation of that doc. So that's how the toJSON method works. So what ret is going to look like is like this. So it's going to have every property like we see on our object over here. So it's going to have, ID, some value, and it's going to have name, and some value for that. So that's what that object looks like. So in order to specify only the properties that we want, rather than doing that on the controller level, let's do it here in this method. That way it's going to apply to all of our controller methods whenever we turn one into JSON. So what we're going to do is we're going to use some ES 2015 object destructuring. So instead of ret, let's actually replace that with an object and select just the properties that we want. So when we send a user back as a response, really all we ever want to see is the ID, so we go _ID, the name, and the email. We don't need any of these other properties. We especially don't want the password there, so we'll just leave it at that. And then that means that from this method, we can use some really simple syntax here and simply return those. I was thinking of the word properties. We can return those properties just like that. So let's come back over to Postman again, and we can rerun this request. And first of all, what we want to do is make sure we've got a unique email. And then if we send that again, you'll see that the object we now get back just includes those values that we've picked. So that means our response is now secure. Looking at our controllers now, there's another more subtle security problem that we have. So see here in the create method, which is for our registration endpoint, we're passing rec.body directly to the user model controller. Now the problem with this is that rec.body might have some additional data on it that we aren't expecting, and that might mess up our database somehow if somebody malicious tries to add some additional data on there that could damage our database in some way. So we should really filter that object and only take the values that we're going to need rather than passing the whole thing in. So we can do that in a really similar way to what we did in the toJSON method, and by destructuring rec.body. So let's create this const object, and we're just going to specify the fields that we need again. So we're going to go name, email, and password, and then we assign that to rec.body, and that means any additional properties on that object are just going to be left for garbage collection. So now what we can do is pass in an object with all those properties into users, and that should work. So we also want to do the same thing though on our items controller, because we have an items create method here as well, and that's going to be subject to similar problems. So for this one, the properties that we're going to need are title, artist, year, price, and image. And again, we just assign that to rec body, and then we pass in an object with all those properties on it. Okay, so what we should do now is let's run our unit test again now that we've made some fairly substantial changes. So I'm going to come up here and end the server, npm run test unit server, and if we run that, we see that we've got 6 out of 6 passing tests, so that means everything's fine on that end. Now keep in mind though that our post users endpoint, it doesn't have any unit tests yet, so what we should do is just come over to Postman and we can just do a very light smoke test on that at least and make sure that one works. So we'll just run our server again. Now we'll come over to Postman, and that still works, so that gives us a good indication that everything is fine.